For as long as I can remember, the land between Umuchieze and Nduka had been a ticking time bomb. Our forefathers had tilled the same soil, watered the same streams, and yet, a long-standing dispute over boundaries had turned us into bitter enemies. It all began during the farming season, as it always did. Farmers from Nduka ventured too far into the contested land, and Umuchieze warriors, seeing this as an intrusion, retaliated. What started as a mere verbal confrontation quickly escalated into bloodshed. Men sharpened their machetes, women wailed in anticipation of loss, and elders convened emergency meetings under the ancient Iroko tree to prevent war. But the call for peace was already drowned by the cry for vengeance. I was a boy of 15 when I first witnessed the horror of war. My father, a respected farmer in Umuchieze, had always warned me about the dangers of crossing into Nduka's claimed land. They do not forgive, he would say. The first time I saw a man fall to the ground, clutching his chest as blood oozed from his wounds, I understood what he meant. The land we fought over drank more blood than rainwater. The farmers who dared plant seeds in the disputed areas became the first casualties. With each passing day, the war worsened. Homes were set ablaze under the cover of darkness, children hid in forests, and the laughter that once filled the village square was replaced by mourning cries. The government had heard of our plight, but they were distant observers. Peace talks were mere formalities, as neither side was willing to compromise. The land was sacred, and so was the fight to keep it. The first official strike came at dawn when Nduka warriors, under the orders of their elders, attacked Umuchieze farms. They slaughtered livestock, set yam barns on fire, and left warning signs carved into trees. My father rushed home, his face darkened by soot and rage. We must retaliate, he told my uncle, who had already tied his machete to his waist. In moments, our men gathered, and the battle cries of Umuchieze echoed through the valley. The attack was swift and brutal. We stormed Nduka's farmlands, destroying their cassava fields and taking down anyone who resisted. The sight of burning crops sent chills down my spine. Food meant to feed families was now turned to ashes in the name of revenge. I saw my friend, Igbo, fall to an arrow aimed at his heart. His mother screamed his name as she rushed to his lifeless body, but war had no ears for grief. By midday, the land was littered with corpses, and the air reeked of blood. That night, the elders of both villages held a meeting in the presence of the local government chairman. He begged for peace, but his words were meaningless. Until justice is served, we will not rest, one of the Umuchieze elders declared. I sat in the corner, listening. There was no justice in war, only pain and loss. The days that followed the attack were filled with unbearable silence. The air smelled of burnt crops, and the rivers ran red with the blood of fallen warriors. Women wailed over the bodies of their husbands, fathers, and sons. The elders of Umuchieze gathered once again under the ancient Iroko tree, their faces grim. We must not let this go unanswered, said poor Odolai, his voice thick with grief. If Nduka thinks they can push us off our land, they are mistaken. I watched as the men of my village sharpened their weapons, their eyes burning with the fire of vengeance. My father, who had always been a man of peace, sat quietly in the corner of our compound, deep in thought. This war will destroy us all, he muttered. But how do you tell men blinded by rage to put down their swords? The night before our retaliation, he took me aside and said, "Remember, war does not have a victor, only survivors." I did not understand his words then, but I would come to learn their truth in the days ahead. As the sun rose, the warriors of Umuchieze, including my elder brother, took to the battlefield. The clash of machetes and the cries of wounded men filled the air. I hid behind a tree, my heart pounding as I watched my people fight for land that had become a graveyard. It was then that I realized, we were all prisoners of a war that had no end. The battle raged for hours, and when the dust finally settled, both sides had suffered greatly. The once thriving farmlands were now a wasteland of broken bodies and burnt crops. My brother returned home, his clothes soaked in blood, not his own, but that of the men he had slain. He did not speak a word, but his eyes told a story of horror. The government sent their representatives once again, this time with soldiers to restore order. They gathered the elders from both villages, urging them to lay down their arms. "The land belongs to no man," the district officer declared. "It is the people who belong to the land." But neither Umuchieze nor Nduka was willing to listen. We were too consumed by grief, too buried under the weight of our dead. That night, my mother sat beside me and whispered, "Your father does not want you to fight." I looked at my father, who had not touched his food. He had lost 2 brothers in the war. "But if I don't fight, who will protect our home?" I asked. He sighed. "A home built on blood will never stand, my son." His words haunted me for many years to come. As the war stretched into weeks, rumors began to spread. Some said the land dispute was not as simple as we had believed. An old man from Nduka, on his deathbed, confessed to something shocking. The land in question had once belonged to neither village but had been forcefully taken generations ago by a forgotten ruler. The truth shook the foundation of our fight. Poor Odolai summoned the elders for an urgent meeting. The old man's confession had changed everything. "If this land was stolen long ago, then what are we truly fighting for?" he asked. But the younger warriors, drunk on vengeance, refused to accept it. "It does not matter," they argued. "It is ours now, and we will not surrender it." I listened in silence. The war was no longer about land, it had become a battle of pride and revenge. Even when faced with the truth, neither side was willing to back down. I wondered how many more would have to die before we realized that the land itself had become our greatest curse. The war took an unexpected turn when Chief Obika, the oldest and most respected leader of Umuchieze, was ambushed and killed. His death sent waves of grief through our village. He had always been the voice of reason, the only one who truly sought peace. Without him, the remaining elders were powerless against the rising tide of war. The news of his death spread quickly, and by nightfall, the warriors of Umuchieze were already sharpening their weapons. My father stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "We must strike before they think us weak," my uncle declared, gripping his machete tightly. But my father did not move. "Obika wanted peace," he said. "If we avenge his death, we dishonor his memory." His words angered the men. "Peace will not bring him back," they retorted. "But vengeance will." I lay awake that night, torn between loyalty to my people and the wisdom of my father. As I listened to the distant sounds of mourning, I realized something: there was no right side in this war. We were all drowning in the same river of blood, and none of us knew how to swim out. At dawn, the warriors of Umuchieze launched their revenge attack. The burning of Nduka's farmland mirrored what they had done to us, but this time, it was more brutal. The warriors stormed homes, dragging out men who had not yet fled. Some were cut down in the streets, while others were taken as prisoners. The cries of women filled the air as their loved ones were slaughtered. I stood on the hill overlooking the battlefield, my heart heavy. My father's words echoed in my mind: "A home built on blood will never stand." When the attack was over, Umuchieze returned home victorious, but there was no celebration. The war had reached a point where neither side could claim true victory. The bodies of our own warriors lay among those of Nduka, and grief was shared on both sides. That night, my father sat by the fire, his eyes lost in thought. "This war will not end until there is nothing left of us," he said. But the younger men, fueled by hatred, refused to listen. To them, the war had become a legacy, something to pass down to the next generation. I was beginning to understand something that the elders had always known: war does not end because men grow tired of fighting. It ends when there is nothing left to fight for. One evening, a shocking revelation changed everything. One of the captured warriors from Nduka, a man named Ikin, was brought before the elders. Under the pressure of interrogation, he made a confession that sent waves of disbelief through our village. "The war is not about land," he said. "It is about power." According to him, certain politicians and wealthy landowners had fueled the conflict, using the communities as pawns in a larger scheme. He claimed that government officials had promised the disputed land to investors, knowing fully well that neither Umuchieze nor Nduka would willingly give it up. By keeping us at war, they ensured that the land remained in dispute, making it easier to take once we had destroyed ourselves. They wanted us to kill each other until the land was empty, he confessed. Then they would step in and take everything. The elders of both villages were horrified. For years, they had believed the war was about honor and heritage, but in reality, they had been pawns in a larger game. The district officer, upon hearing the confession, vowed to investigate further. If what you say is true, heads will roll, he promised. But even with this revelation, resentment still burned within the people. Knowing the war had been manipulated did not erase the pain of lost lives. The question remained, could peace truly come when so many still carried hatred in their hearts? The government forced a peace summit between the elders of both villages. The people gathered in a large open field, soldiers watching closely to prevent any violence. The elders of Umuchieze and Nduka sat together for the first time in decades, their faces heavy with age and sorrow. My father was one of the speakers. We have been fighting for years, but look at what remains, graves, widows, orphans, he said. If we do not stop, there will be no one left to inherit this land. His words moved some, but others were not ready to forgive. One elder from Nduka stood. How do we forget the blood that was spilled, he asked. How do we break a cycle that has lasted for generations? Silence followed, as no one had an answer. But for the first time, both villages were listening to each other, and that, in itself, was a small step forward. After hours of tense discussions, an agreement was finally reached. Both villages would divide the land according to the government's ruling, but there would be compensation for those who lost their homes. The government promised aid to rebuild farms and provide security. But as the elders shook hands, I saw the faces of some warriors. Their eyes were dark with anger. They did not want peace. They wanted vengeance. I feared that the war was far from over. Even after the agreement was signed, trust was still missing. The people of Umuchieze and Nduka lived as neighbors, but not as brothers. Farmers from both villages refused to step on each other's land. Children were warned never to play with those from the other village. The scars of war ran deep, and healing would take time. One night, a devastating betrayal occurred. A group of warriors from Nduka, refusing to accept the peace treaty, launched a secret attack on an Umuchieze farm. They burned the crops and killed the farmers. By morning, the village was in chaos once again. The elders of Umuchieze accused Nduka of breaking the peace agreement, and what seemed inevitable once more. The government, furious that their efforts were being undermined, declared a strict curfew. Any act of violence would be met with imprisonment. The soldiers arrested the attackers, but their actions had already reignited old wounds. It was clear now, true peace could not come through government force alone. It had to come from within the hearts of the people. But with so much pain, was that even possible? Realizing that the government could not solve their hatred, the elders of both villages took matters into their own hands. They called for a sacred cleansing ceremony, an ancient ritual meant to wash away past grievances. The warriors, now divided, hesitated. Some saw it as a sign of weakness, while others saw it as the only way forward. The ritual took place at the river, the same river that had once carried the bodies of the dead. The elders from both villages stood together, offering prayers and sacrifices to the gods of the land. Let the past be buried, they declared. Let the land be reborn. At first, nothing seemed to change. But then, in the days that followed, something remarkable happened. An old woman from Nduka gave food to a hungry child from Umuchieze. A farmer from Umuchieze helped repair a broken fence in Nduka. Small acts of kindness, barely noticeable at first, began to spread. The peace process was fragile. Every small act of goodwill was met with suspicion, and the wounds of war still bled in the hearts of many. Just when it seemed that the villages were beginning to heal, a terrible crisis struck. An outbreak of disease swept through both communities. The sickness spread fast, attacking the young and the old. Children developed fevers, and the elderly weakened overnight. The village healers were overwhelmed, and soon, the government sent medical teams to contain the outbreak. But the hospitals were far, and some refused to take treatment from their former enemies. How can I trust the Nduka doctor with my child? One woman from Umuchieze asked. The same question was echoed in Nduka. The disease did not care for past grudges. It took lives from both villages equally, forcing them to see a bitter truth: if they continued to fight, they would all perish. In their moment of desperation, an unlikely cooperation began. People crossed the new boundaries, not with weapons, but with medicine and food. One night, a heartbreaking event changed everything. A young girl from Nduka, barely 10 years old, fell sick. With no one to help, her mother, in tears, ran to Umuchieze, begging for medicine. "Please," she wept, "at the doorstep of my father's house. She will die if you do not help." The hesitation in the air was heavy. The war had made trust a foreign thing. But then, my mother stepped forward. Without a word, she handed the woman the medicine she had saved for my younger sister. "Go, before it's too late," she whispered. News of the act spread, and suddenly, others began to follow. Families who once saw each other as enemies now worked together to fight a common enemy, the disease. The war had not ended because of treaties or soldiers. It had ended because, for the first time, people saw their enemies as human. As the sickness faded, something unexpected remained: friendship. Farmers from both villages began to trade crops, helping each other recover from the destruction of war. The river, once a place of bloodshed, became a meeting ground once again. The government, seeing the changes, offered a final gesture of peace. They provided new farming equipment and resources, ensuring that both villages could rebuild. "We cannot undo the past," the district officer said, "but we can choose a better future." Still, not everyone was ready to forgive. Some warriors refused to set down their grudges, but they were now a minority. The people had suffered too much to go back. And so, slowly, the villages that had fought for generations began to see a future where their children did not have to grow up with war. Despite the progress, a final threat loomed: Ogbonna, the warlord from Nduka, and his followers refused peace. "This is weakness," he spat. "They will betray us again, and we will be unprepared." Fearing another attack, the elders of Nduka made a painful decision. Ogbonna and his men were exiled from the village, sent away to live in the forest. "If we are to heal, we must remove the poison from our midst," the chief of Nduka declared. The decision was controversial, but necessary. For the first time, the warriors of Umuchieze did not retaliate. Instead, they extended a hand of peace. "We will not seek revenge," my father said. "The war ends here." It was the hardest choice they had ever made, but it was also the most powerful. As the years passed, the new generation grew up hearing the stories of war, but they did not experience it. Instead, they saw their parents working together, rebuilding homes, and farming together. A school was built near the border, where children from both villages studied together. "Let them learn each other's ways," the elders said. "Let them never repeat our mistakes." My own nephew, a boy born after the war, asked me one day, "Uncle, why did we fight?" I had no answer. What once seemed so important had become senseless in hindsight. The war had taken everything, and in the end, no one had truly won. To solidify their bond, the elders of both villages decided to create something that had never been done before: a joint festival. The Festival of Peace. It would be held once a year at the river, celebrating not just their survival, but their unity. The first festival was tense at first. People still held grudges, and some refused to participate. But as the music played and the food was shared, laughter broke the silence. Slowly, the people danced together, ate together, and for the first time in generations, they saw each other as family. The warriors of old watched from a distance, unsure of their place in this new era. But even they had to admit, the peace felt right. My father, one of the last voices of the war generation, grew weaker with age. On his deathbed, he called me close. "We fought for nothing," he whispered. "But you, and those after you, must fight for peace." His funeral